So today I want to talk about how to connect a Boss GX-10 to a Boss Katana, something like this. All of this information that I'm going to give you today, though, is going to apply to almost any modeler and almost any amp. I selected 4 methods that I think apply to most guitarists, and one of these methods is almost certainly going to work for your specific application. It is important to note that while I aim to explain how to connect these devices, I'm not going to cover how to get the best sounds out of them. I think that topic deserves its own conversation entirely. Additionally, this video is going to specifically focus on the Boss Katana and GX-10, so some of this information will simply have to be translated to some of your own equipment if you happen to be using something else. With that said, let's jump into it. So let's talk about option 1, which is going straight into the amp. So in this case, your guitar is going to be plugged straight into the GX-10, and then your GX-10 is going to be plugged straight into the front of your amp. Now, in this case, if you decide to do this, there are going to be some really big compromises. You're really not going to get the most out of either of your devices. But if you do opt for this method, you are going to want to make sure that you go into the GX-10 output settings and change it to one of the Katana input options. In my case, I have a regular Katana 100. This should work just the same for the 50. There is an option for Katana 100 2x12, so if you happen to have the 2x12 cabinet, that's the choice you're going to want to pick. And this is pretty much what the signal chain is going to look like. So this is a pretty standard default signal chain in a GX-10, and this is a pretty standard default signal chain in a Katana. And what you're going to notice about these signal chains is they tend to follow a pattern. And this pattern is typically a best practice for people who are trying to get their effects to sound good out of the box without thinking about it too much. These are rules that are absolutely meant to be broken, but most of the time you're going to find in a signal chain that things like your wahs, filters, compressions, boosts, distortions, EQs, a lot of those things tend to come before your amplifier. And the effects that are more like your choruses, delays, reverbs, echoes, those tend to come after your amplification. And you'll notice that in this default signal chain for the GX-10, it follows that pattern. The Katana also follows that pattern by default. Now, you can modify the signal chain in the Katana, and you can modify the signal chain in the GX-10, but if you were to just plug these in, this is pretty much what's going to happen to you. And you really don't want to hear what this is going to sound like if you turn on all of these effects. It's going to sound horrible. And primarily that's because you're going to have this amp AIRD model in the GX-10 running, and you're also going to have an amp running in the Katana and a speaker. So you're getting 2 cabinet emulations, you're getting 2 amp emulations. In effect, it would be like plugging one amplifier straight into another one. It's just not going to sound very good. So if you want to make it sound good, I suggest that you basically take out everything at the end of the signal chain in the GX-10 from the amp onward. You want to just let your Katana give you the amp sounds, and you only want your GX-10 to focus on the types of effects you want to hear before your amplified sound. Now, there's no reason you couldn't put, say, like a delay in front of your amplifier, but anyone who has messed with delays, reverbs, echoes before an amp sound knows that if you turn the gain up on that amp, if you distort that sound in that amplifier, those reverbs and effects are also distorting, and they tend to sound muddy. So the better choice tends to be to let your amplifier do its distortion, let your pedals do all of the distortion, then come in and do those reverbs, those echoes, those choruses, things like that. Take a good sounding distortion and now give it those effects. So when you do a combination like this, you're losing a lot of the possible effects out of the GX-10, a lot of the amp models, and then the Katana, you're losing all of its boosters and effects, and you're really only keeping the amp, the delays and reverbs, and the speaker. So there's big compromises to doing something like this. Now let's try another option, and that's placing the GX-10 in the effects loop. So not all amplifiers are going to have this, and if you don't, you can feel free to skip this section. But the effects loop is intended to place the signal chain in a different location. So in this case, we're going to plug our guitar directly into the front of the amp, into that amp input. It is going to begin doing its thing, and somewhere in the Katana signal path, it's going to send the sound out into the GX-10. The GX-10 is going to be allowed to input its own pieces into the signal chain, send it back into the Katana, and out. Now, again, if you choose to do a setup like this, you're going to want to go into the output settings of the GX-10 and select a return option rather than an input option for your particular amplifier. So, looking at the signal chain, there are a number of ways that this could go. So, the first way that this could go is the Katana has a few options to pick from for how to set up that send and return. And the first position that it allows you to pick, and I think this is the default position as well, is post amp. So what that means is in this Katana signal chain, because it's coming first, right? My guitar is plugged into the amplifier. It's going to come into the Katana. It's going to apply any boost, any mod, any effects. It's going to go ahead and give you your amp sound, be it clean, crunch, lead, etc. Once it's applied those effects now, because our send is post amp, it is now going to allow the sound to be sent out at that moment in time, and that's where it's coming into the GX-10. So the GX-10 is now going to apply its full signal chain, and as soon as it's done, it's going to send the sound right back to the Katana, and that's going to return in and allow the Katana to finish with its delays, its reverbs, and then out to the cabinet. So that is one way that it could be inserted into the signal chain. Notice, however, that the Katana can also do a post-reverb send return. So instead of this GX-10 being pasted right here, right after the amplifier, it's now pasting itself in right here after the reverb. Basically, the Katana is doing almost all of its effects before the speaker, and then you're allowed to add more from the GX-10. The third option, and I'm not going to suggest this one, is you can set your Katana to do parallel effects. So in a parallel send, what's happening is the signal is actually being sent two places simultaneously. In this case, we would have called this a series effect because the entire sound is being sent through each effect. And in the parallel version, what's going to happen is some percentage of that sound is going to be sent out somewhere else, and some percentage of the sound is going to continue forward. And the reason that I'm not going to suggest you do that with this particular setup with a modeler is it doesn't give you a whole lot of flexibility. There's not a whole lot you can do with that parallel chain. And almost anything that you could do with that parallel chain is actually easier done with a different setup because the GX-10 makes parallel effects so much easier. There's almost no reason you should consider running a parallel effect directly through the Katana when you have so much more flexibility available to you in the GX-10. So, that being said, we're gonna keep moving forward to the suggestions, but just know I'm not gonna recommend that you do a parallel mode. If anyone, however, does have any use case they can imagine for running parallel out of the Katana, I am super interested. Drop a comment, tell me how you're using the parallel mode. People are super creative. Someone has probably come up with a very specific reason with a very cool, specific sound that's accomplishable with this setup, but I can think of none. So feel free to drop some ideas in the comments. So moving on to this first idea. If we are setting our effects chain right after the amplifier, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that you cut out, again, all of these effects that tend to come before an amp and the amplifier within the GX-10. Why do I say that? Well, functionally, the Katana is doing that work for us. The Katana is giving us the boost, the mod, the FX, and it's placing them correctly before the amplifier. And when I say correctly, again, rules are meant to be broken, but in most setups, I don't want a booster before an amplifier and after an amplifier. I don't want these effects being duplicated in any way, shape, or form after the amplifier. So I'm going to let these effects stay in the signal chain where I tend to prefer them. Now, I'm only going to let the GX-10 handle the things like EQs, maybe, volume, because an EQ can go anywhere in a signal chain. most of the time. A volume can go anywhere in a signal chain most of the time. Choruses, delays, reverbs. Again, those effects that are big sounding, that are duplicating sounds in interesting ways. Those are the things I'm going to let the GX10 handle. And now in the Katana, I'm explicitly not going to use its delays and reverbs. And there's really no reason why you couldn't use both signals you get from the GX10 and the Katana. It's just that the GX10 is loaded with effects that are just more in-depth than the ones that come with the Katana. So while you could theoretically use these and it would sound perfectly fine, there's almost no reason to when the GX10 has the better effects in it. Now it's going to come out of the speaker. So again, if you were to just cut out these X'd out parts, you should be able to see the same basic sort of chain that one device would typically offer you. All the boosters, mods, effects, amp. All of your courses, delays, reverbs, echoes, speaker. We're just picking which device is going to do each. Now in this case, we're moving the effects loop to be after the reverb. And in this case, I'm cutting out the exact same sections of the chain, right? I'm cutting out the delays and the reverbs from the Katana, and I'm letting the GX10 handle those. And from the GX10, I'm cutting out all of the effects that tend to come before the amp, and I'm letting the Katana do that. So functionally, we're creating the same signal chain using the same devices, regardless of whether you go post-amp or post-reverb. You just need to know which signal your Katana is set to use, and by default, it tends to be this one. So this is how it's going to be set up. Now, parallel, again, I'm putting a big red X through because I think that anything you might accomplish with this setup is going to be better accomplished with this next option. So option 3, straight into the power amp. So in this case, this is a lot like the setup that we talked about first, option 1, going straight into the input. But in this case, there's a jack in the back of the amplifier called power amp in, and we're going to want to use that jack instead. So just as a quick aside, what is a power amp input? Well, a power amp input allows us to use the Katana functionally as just a speaker, as a cabinet. What it's going to do is it's going to allow us to bypass all of the effects and amp sounds, the preamp of the Boss Katana, and allow us to just use it as a powered speaker. That said, this is not like running into a PA, like running to a PA front of house, for example, because PA speakers, so we call them, tend to be full range speakers that can accommodate things like pianos, keyboards, bass guitars. A power amp input on an amplifier like this is still giving you a real guitar cabinet sound, which is to say that this speaker is still actually shaping the sound that you are hearing, unlike a PA system that you would see at some sort of a live venue. So with that said, if you're going to do this, again, you're going to want that GX10 output setting set to return. And now your signal chain is functionally going to look like this, where by default, you are getting the entire signal chain out of the GX10, and you're getting the cabinet sound of your amplifier. And I really, really like this setup. There's so much to learn and explore here. If you have no idea how to set up a signal chain, and all of this feels complicated, this, I believe, is the default way that you should pick to set this up. And the reason is the GX10 gives you a really cool way to set up complicated signal chains on it. And then you can just avoid all of the complication of thinking about which parts of the signal chain are happening in which device. Instead, the entire signal chain is happening in the GX10, and the Katana is just acting as the amplified sound. So there's only one caveat here. And that one caveat is that within this amplifier that the GX10 gives you, it's emulating an amplifier and a cabinet. And so because we're using the cabinet out of our Katana, we want to turn off the cabinet emulation within that amplifier. And if you go into any one of these AIRD preamp settings and you look through everything that it offers you, you will find a speaker type, and you want to turn that off. It doesn't always sound terrible to leave the speaker as it is, but what it's doing is it's sort of double shaping the sound in a way that is sort of physically impossible. It's pretending to shape the sound to match a different cabinet and then running it through your actual real cabinet, so it's sort of double filtering the sound. So we want to turn that off. With this setup, we want to allow that cabinet from the Boss Katana to shine. And this is a case where if you happen to have something like an artist series with a Waza cabinet, you definitely want to let that cabinet shine, right? That speaker is designed to have its own character, its own awesome character, and we want to let that shine through. So we're going to turn off the speaker type. Now, that being said, the ForCable method is another method you're going to see pop up all over the internet, and people are going to talk about doing it. And the ForCable method is designed functionally to address all of the shortcomings we mentioned in option 1 and 2. And what it's allowing us to do is surgically pick which parts of each of these two devices we're using in the chain. So I want to point out, with option 3, we are really reducing the Katana to just a speaker. We're saying that the GX-10 is doing all of the heavy lifting, and the Katana is really just there to give us a sort of a speaker sound. That's it. A ForCable method we want to bring into the picture when we like parts of those sounds we're getting out of the Katana, and we like some of the sounds we're getting out of the GX-10, and we want to be able to selectively use both of them in the signal chain. So in this case, the guitar is going to plug into our GX-10, then it's going to do its thing, and then it's going to send the sound out into the input on the front of the amplifier, which is going to do its thing, and from its effects send, it's going to come into the return of the GX-10. Then that GX-10 is going to send the output back into the effects return of the Katana. And this seems deeply complicated when you look at a diagram like this, but actually the way that it impacts the signal chain is fairly straightforward. It's kind of intuitive, actually. So if we look at the GX-10 signal chain, when we plug in, I'm going to set the send return where I would commonly see it in this sort of a setup, which is typically right before the amplifier. So the GX-10 is going to give me my wahs, my compressors, my boosts, distortions, maybe there's an EQ. Now it's going to send the sound. So the GX-10 is handling all of the effects in this case that come before the amplifier. Now it's going to send return, and remember that send is coming into the preamp of the Katana. So what that means is I'm going to want to use any sorts of boosters, mods, effects I might want. So let's say I prefer some that are in the Katana. Those are allowed to exist. Now, the amplifier sound, so that Katana lead sound that you really like, or the brown sound that you really like, you're going to use that Katana amp sound. Now, it's going to use its effects send to come back to the GX-10, so that the GX-10 can give me choruses, delays, reverbs, and then it's going to send right back to the Katana to use the speaker. So what we're really doing here is we're saying we want this amplifier, this Katana, to be our amp sound, to be our cabinet sound. And we want this GX-10 to be all of the effects. And this is the most common way that you're going to see a ForCable method set up, which is turning this into a multi-effects pedal handling all of your effects and letting your Boss Katana be all of your amp sounds. Now, there's a really good article from Andertons on the ForCable method, and when it's presented this way, it often looks a little bit more intuitive, which is your guitar is going to go into all the effects you tend to put in front of an amplifier. That's going to go into the amplifier. Now that amplifier is going to have an effects loop that's going to allow you to insert all the effects you tend to put after the amplifier. Those return and go through the cabinet. And this is where this concept comes from. And so a multi-effects pedal like this has to be able to emulate something like this for you, because if it couldn't do that, it would have a distinct disadvantage compared to using classic pedals. This is how you accomplish that same thing, but using something like a multi-effects pedal and a katana. Now, there are some fun other things that you can do apart from this very basic use case. And one example is within your GX-10, you actually still can use some of the AIRD models in it. So this would be an example of something like a wet-dry mix. So there's this cool feature in the signal chain called a div, and a div allows you to do one of two things. Either you can run parallel effects, meaning that it's going to run both of these chains simultaneously and then mix the sounds back together, or a div allows you to switch between which side of this parallel setup you want, i.e., what I could do is I could say switch between an amp sound in the katana via the send return slot, or an AIRD built into my GX10. So if I wanted to switch, maybe for example, I really like a brown sound out of the katana, but I really like a clean sound out of the GX10. Well, I could leave this as a natural amp, which is a clean amp sound, and I could leave it very dry or add whatever effects I wanted. I could do that as well. And on the other side, I could have that brown sound. So maybe I switch to a solo. This div is going to switch me to this signal chain instead, which is using those katana sounds. And it's still letting me apply the effects from the GX10 if I want to before it comes back. Now, a wet-dry mix is probably the more interesting way to do this. And so what I would do here is I would have something like a very natural guitar sound, and it's going to run straight through with no added sounds to it. And then I'm going to have this overdriven sound on the other half. And when you mix that overdriven sound with that very natural sound, you get all of this very beautiful information that's present in a natural guitar sound that you can mix in any proportion that you want. And if you've never tried mixing in a relatively dry sound in with a distorted sound, it's an amazing thing. Wet dry rigs are incredibly popular, and you're going to find that running dual amplifiers like this separately is extremely popular among professional musicians. The most notable one I can think of off the top of my head being Joe Bonamassa. But what differs here from what we talked about in option 1 is I'm not running the sound from one amp directly into another amplifier. What I'm doing is I'm actually splitting the signal and letting one run through one amplifier and the other run through a different amplifier, and then mixing the sound at the end. That is distinctly different than running an amp directly into another amp. Now, the only one caveat to do this, you again need to turn off the speaker within the AIRD setup. And you need to do that because at the end, this is going through the Katana cabinet. So we don't want to duplicate cabinet sounds. This concept right here can be split into so many different variations. You can use, a distorted sound from the AIRD and a clean sound from your Katana. You can even set things up such that you have more splits. There's so many interesting ways you could move the choruses or delays to different positions in the signal chain. There's so many fascinating ways you can set up these signal chains when you're in this position. So this is also deeply flexible. The only reason I don't suggest that most people start with this method is it does force you to think about which devices are creating which components of your sound. And for a lot of people, they might actually find that the amp sounds within the GX10 maybe are just resoundingly better than the Katana sounds. And if you do feel that way, or if you do feel like they're even on par, there's complication here that can be entirely avoided with option 3, where the GX10 can still do its cool parallel sounds with, multiple amps, wet and dry, just using the Katana only as a speaker. So for most people, I'm going to suggest that this is the method right here, which is straight into the power amp of the Boss Katana. But I mean, honestly, the ForCable method has some really, really fun things to try out as well. And if you happen to have enough cables on hand to give this a shot, it's really pretty interesting. And I think that this method really, really shows its value when you're not using a Boss Katana, but rather a real tube amplifier. And the reason I say that is these AIRD models, these Katana amp models, they're digital amp sounds. And if you really want some very, very classic real tube amp sounds, then what you're effectively getting is a Boss GX-10 that's acting like a multi-effects unit, giving you really, really complicated signal chain options. And this amp sound and speaker sound in here are actual tube amp sounds. So if your tube amp happens to be loaded with the send return, I actually do deeply recommend the ForCable method because you can start to experiment with some of these very, very, very class-leading Boss effects with beautiful tube amp valve sounds. So these are the 4 ways that I can think of that you should consider using your modeler with your amplifier. If you have any questions, any ideas, or even your own cool ideas of signal chains that you've created, drop a comment and let us know if this video was helpful or if you need some more information. Thanks.